You know what's fascinating? We often imagine power in relationships as the one who withdraws, who shuts down, who avoids. But the truth is, nothing shakes the avoidant more than when the super empath finally goes silent, not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of clarity. The avoidant feeds on control. They've grown used to the dynamic, push you away, then pull you back just enough so you don't leave. But when the super empath, who once gave endless chances, finally draws the line and retreats into stillness, that silence echoes louder than any argument could. Why? Because it's not reactive. It's not a game. It's the silence of someone who has outgrown the cycle. And for the avoidant, that realization that they no longer have power, that their patterns no longer land, haunts them. The empath's silence isn't coldness, it's self-respect. It's a decision. I don't need to scream for you to hear me. I don't need to chase for you to see my value. I'm choosing me. And in that moment, the avoidant is left with the one thing they fear most, their own emptiness, reflected back at them. Here's the paradox. The super empath silence is not punishment, it's freedom. And yet, for the avoidant, it feels like a sentence they can't escape, because the echo of that silence follows them long after the empath has moved on. The power shift happens when the empath's silence is no longer reactive, but intentional. At first, the empath's silence might appear the same on the surface, quiet, withdrawn, seemingly distant. But the energy underneath it is entirely different. When silence is reactive, it often comes from hurt, from being overwhelmed, from feeling like words won't land, or that speaking will only escalate things. The avoidant can sense that. They read it as temporary, as something they can wait out. In fact, it often reassures them because it means the empath is still inside the cycle, still emotionally entangled, still waiting to be noticed, validated, or drawn back in. But when silence becomes intentional, it carries a very different weight. This silence isn't about punishing the other person. It isn't even about waiting for them to notice. It's about making a decision to no longer participate in a dynamic that depletes one's spirit. The empath has finally crossed the threshold where the energy once poured into explaining, fixing, or understanding has been reclaimed. And once that energy is reclaimed, the entire balance of power shifts. The avoidant is used to their distance being the weapon. They withhold, they detach, they create space to maintain control. They're familiar with this dance, pulling away, then re-engaging just enough to keep the connection alive. But when the empath chooses silence intentionally, that weapon is neutralized. The avoidant no longer gets to define the rhythm of the relationship because the empath is no longer dancing. The silence is not a pause, it's an ending. This moment is haunting for the avoidant precisely because it's not loud. It doesn't come with accusations or emotional fireworks. It's quiet, composed, and final. There's no crack to slip through, no thread to pull on, no apology that can instantly reset things. For the first time, the avoidant feels powerless because the silence doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't even acknowledge their control. It simply withdraws it. What makes this so profound is that the empath's intentional silence speaks volumes about growth. It's not the silence of despair, it's the silence of self-preservation and self-respect. It signals that the empath has stepped outside of the game and found strength in detachment, and that is what unsettles the avoidant most. They don't just lose access to the empath's voice, they lose access to the empath's energy, their forgiveness, their willingness to re-engage after every rupture. When silence is reactive, it leaves the door cracked open, waiting for the avoidant to return. But when it's intentional, the door isn't just closed, it's locked. That shift is invisible to the outside world, but the avoidant feels it deeply, because for the first time, their usual strategies no longer work. The dynamic they relied on has dissolved. They're left staring into a void where the empath's warmth used to be, realizing that silence can feel louder than any storm of words ever could. The avoidant is haunted because they lose control of the push-pull dynamic. For so long, this rhythm has been their safety net. They've relied on the pattern. Create distance when closeness feels overwhelming, then return when the silence becomes too heavy or when they fear the other person might actually walk away. The cycle gives them control. It allows them to feel both independent and secure without ever truly committing to the vulnerability that real intimacy requires. And as long as the empath remains responsive, reaching out during the push, welcoming them back during the pull, the avoidant feels they are directing the dance. But when the empath finally grows tired of that cycle and steps out of it, the avoidant's carefully constructed control collapses. Suddenly, the push no longer has the same effect. The empath doesn't rush to close the gap or plead for closeness. The pull no longer sparks relief, because when the avoidant tries to return, the warmth they expect is absent. The script they've rehearsed no longer works, and that loss of predictability rattles them deeply. The haunting begins in the realization that their actions no longer shape the other person's behavior. For the avoidant, power has always been found in subtle control, deciding when the relationship moves closer and when it drifts apart. But when silence and stillness replace the empath's usual response, the avoidant is left exposed. They're confronted with the truth that the other person no longer needs the cycle to feel whole. And that is terrifying because it means they're no longer the center of the dynamic, they're no longer necessary for it to exist. This is what lingers in their mind long after the empath has moved on. They can't stop thinking about the sudden shift, the missing rhythm, the absence of reaction that once affirmed their control. It unsettles them because it breaks the illusion that they could always return and find the empath waiting, ready to resume the familiar dance. Losing that control is more than just losing a partner. It's losing the framework they've relied on to manage closeness their entire life. The silence that replaces it becomes a reminder of the one thing they've worked hardest to avoid, the emptiness that comes when no one is willing to play the game anymore. Silence from the empath signals self-respect, not punishment. That distinction is everything, because while it may feel like rejection to the avoidant, in truth it's an act of profound self-preservation. The empath has often been the one to overextend, to explain, to forgive, to soften every jagged edge in the relationship. They've spent countless moments trying to decode silences, to interpret mixed signals, to prove through their patience and devotion that love is worth fighting for. But when silence finally arrives, it is not laced with bitterness or the need to teach someone a lesson. It comes instead from the quiet strength of realizing, I don't have to prove myself anymore. This silence does not roar or demand attention. It doesn't slam doors or leave behind dramatic exits. It's subtle but unshakable, the kind of silence that comes when someone has found enough value in themselves to no longer settle for half measures. The empath is not trying to manipulate or trigger guilt. They're not hoping that withholding words will spark pursuit. They are simply choosing not to offer their energy where it isn't cherished. That choice, though soft in appearance, carries an undeniable power. For the avoidant, this silence feels colder than any argument because it's not about them anymore. When the empath once raised their voice or expressed pain, it still meant there was an emotional tether. It meant they were invested, that they cared enough to fight, that they were still trying to salvage connection. But self-respecting silence severs that tether. It signals that the empath's attention has been redirected inward toward healing, growth, and peace. And for the avoidant, used to being the gravitational force that keeps the cycle alive, that shift is deeply unsettling. What makes it even more haunting is that the silence doesn't leave obvious openings for re-engagement. Anger invites a rebuttal. Tears invite comfort. Pleading invites negotiation. Silence offers nothing. It doesn't bait. It doesn't argue. It doesn't provide a hook to re-enter. It is whole within itself. And that wholeness communicates something the avoidant has always feared, that they were never needed to complete the empath, only chosen. This is why the silence feels so final. It isn't an attack or a tactic. It's a declaration of worth. The empath's self-respect shows up in the refusal to chase, to over-explain, to fill dead air with reassurances that should have been reciprocated. By withdrawing words, they also withdraw the constant effort that kept the relationship afloat. That effort, once unnoticed, becomes glaring in its absence. In the quiet, the avoidant is confronted not with punishment, but with a mirror. They see, maybe for the first time, the space that was once filled with patience, love, and understanding. And in recognizing that they are left to reckon with the truth, the empath did not go silent to wound them, but to honor themselves. That kind of silence is not a weapon, it is liberation. And liberation, for the one left behind, can sound like abandonment even though it is simply the sound of someone finally choosing peace over chaos. The avoidant is forced to confront their own emptiness without the empath's emotional investment. For so long, the presence of the empath has acted as a cushion, softening the sharp edges of their detachment. Every time the avoidant pulled away, there was someone waiting with reassurance, someone ready to bridge the gap, someone willing to keep the connection alive even when it felt one-sided. That emotional effort from the empath was like a safety net. It allowed the avoidant to feel secure in knowing the bond would survive their withdrawal. But once the empath goes silent, that safety net disappears. The avoidant is left staring into the quiet and realizing there's nothing there to hold them up anymore. This is where the haunting begins. Emptiness is something the avoidant has always carried but rarely confronted because the empath's persistence kept it hidden. The empath's love, words, and presence were like a steady hum in the background, masking the hollow spaces within. When that hum vanishes, the silence becomes deafening. Suddenly, the avoidant is forced to feel the very thing they've spent their life trying to avoid: the absence of true connection, the weight of isolation, the unsettling recognition that the cycle is over and no one is rushing in to fill the void. The emptiness they face is not just about losing the empath, it's about losing the illusion that they could maintain closeness on their own terms indefinitely. The truth becomes undeniable. Relationships can't survive on distance alone. Someone has to show up fully, consistently, vulnerably. And with the empath gone, the avoidant has no buffer left to disguise the fact that they haven't been showing up in that way. What makes this experience even harder is that emptiness doesn't offer distractions. It doesn't argue. It doesn't chase. It doesn't soothe. It just sits there, quietly reflecting back everything the avoidant has avoided confronting: their fear of intimacy, their resistance to vulnerability, their reliance on someone else's effort to maintain connection. Without the empath's emotional investment filling the gaps, the avoidant comes face to face with the stark truth of their own solitude. And that truth lingers, following them long after the relationship has ended, because emptiness isn't something that fades with time, it's something that demands to be acknowledged and eventually healed. Until then, it echoes in the silence the empath leaves behind. The empath's silence represents freedom, but for the avoidant, it lingers like a ghost they cannot shake. For the empath, stepping into silence is not a retreat but a release. It is the moment they decide to stop fighting for someone else's attention and instead reclaim their own energy. That quiet carries no bitterness, no hidden agenda. It is simply the sound of choosing peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, and self-worth over longing. In silence, the empath breathes again. They are no longer trapped in the exhausting cycle of waiting for crumbs of affection or trying to decode mixed signals. Instead, they anchor themselves in stillness, and that stillness feels like freedom. But for the avoidant, that same stillness becomes haunting. What once felt like control, the ability to pull away and return at will, is suddenly shattered. The silence is not the temporary quiet they are used to, the kind that still hums with emotional investment beneath the surface. This silence is different. It is the absence of longing, the absence of effort, the absence of the empath's endless patience. It is a silence that cannot be manipulated or broken because it does not exist for the avoidant's benefit. And that's what makes it follow them long after the empath has gone. They find themselves replaying moments, wondering when exactly the shift occurred, trying to pinpoint the day the empath stopped waiting. The lack of answers gnaws at them because silence does not explain itself. It does not offer closure or even a doorway back in. It simply exists cold and immovable, like a shadow that stretches further the more they try to outrun it. The haunting lies in the contrast. When the empath was present, even in pain, there was warmth. There were words, gestures, and a willingness to try again. That warmth gave the avoidant a sense of security, a reassurance that no matter how far they distanced themselves, someone would be there to welcome them back. But once the silence arrives, the warmth disappears, and the void it leaves behind feels unbearable. What once felt like safety now feels like loss, and the avoidant cannot escape the echo of what used to be. For the empath, silence becomes a doorway into a new chapter, but for the avoidant, it becomes a lingering presence that refuses to fade. It reminds them in every quiet moment of the connection they once had and the choices they made to keep intimacy at arm's length. The silence holds up a mirror they cannot avoid, showing them not what was taken from them, but what they pushed away. And because it carries no anger, no demands, no pleas, it feels even more permanent. It's not something they can argue with, fix, or rewrite. It is simply there, echoing endlessly. What feels like liberation to the empath becomes, for the avoidant, the most haunting sound of all, the silence that tells them the cycle is over and there is no going back. And so the silence of the super empath is not emptiness, it is wholeness. It is not coldness, it is clarity. It is not punishment, it is power. Because when someone who has given everything finally decides to choose themselves, that choice reverberates louder than any words ever could. For the avoidant, that silence becomes an echo that lingers, a reminder of what was lost not because it was taken, but because it was no longer freely given. For the empath, though, that silence is freedom, a doorway into a life where peace is no longer bargained for, but claimed. Thank you for listening, for giving your presence, and for holding space for these truths. May you carry forward the reminder that your voice has value, but so does your silence. And when chosen with self-respect, that silence can be the most powerful statement of all. Thank you and goodbye.